Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of my podcast series. I haven't really come up with a name for this podcast series, but drop it in the comments down below. You guys can suggest something, but I'm sure I'll come up with something soon. Today, I have a very special guest on the podcast. His name is Matt Huang. He has a very interesting and unique background. He has worked across three different industries, both in investment banking, consulting, and tech. Just a quick background about Matt. Matt has worked at Solomon Partners as an investment banking analyst. He then worked at Boston Consulting Group as an associate consultant and is now currently working at Google as a strategy and ops associate. I hope everyone watching this podcast today leaves this episode with more knowledge than you came in with. And that's really the goal behind these podcasts in this series, to bring on more people like Matt. So, just people from non-traditional backgrounds or even traditional backgrounds or early career or people middle of their career or late in their career can just come in and get some piece of wisdom from people like Matt and, see what they're doing to really emulate that and apply that to their lives. So without further ado, let's introduce and bring in Matt. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the intro, Ibrahim. Appreciate it and really excited to be here with everyone today. I'm happy to give a quick background as well, if that's helpful, just to kick things off. So as Ibrahim mentioned, I'm Matt Huang. I am currently working at Google as a strategy and operations associate. But prior to that, I was actually a management consultant at BCG in New York for a few years. And before that, I worked in investment banking at a bank called Solomon Partners as well. And I also happen to run a small YouTube channel on the side where I talk about my experiences working in all three of these different fields and try to just give my audience a more transparent view into what it's like to actually work these jobs. And so I'm really excited here to give you some insights and speak with you today.
Yeah, awesome. I think your story is super unique because, I've personally been watching your channel for quite a long time when you were at BCG. And I remember even back then, like I was interning at like different companies, but even back then I could really relate to your videos because I would see two types of, just a certain type of career videos on YouTube where there would be really smart people with posting these videos or content and like explaining things, but it would be hard to understand. But the way you do it is very different, I feel. And the way you explain like complex things in a very simple manner, like your whiteboard videos, and it just shows because your YouTube channel has grown so much. Just I think in the last 3 months, you have over 20,000 subscribers and your videos are doing great, especially whiteboard videos. Just to get into the first question, I think a lot of early career people are probably wondering, like, what advice would you have for a sophomore, a junior in college right now, going to a Big Ten school, not even an Ivy League, or what advice would you have to them if they're interested in breaking into both tech and consulting?
So I think there's like two different questions because getting into tech versus consulting is a little bit different. I think there's a lot of information on like getting into both of these fields, but it also depends on what kind of role you're going for, because typically the content you see online for tech is like software engineer roles in tech. There's less content on like non-technical or business-oriented facing roles. And then on the consulting side, there's a lot of information on how to recruit. And so if you're going for consulting, you're going to be very focused on networking with consultants. You're going to be very focused on preparing for case interviews, which is like the big hurdle that everyone who gets into a top consulting firm has to master. And then on the tech side, it's a little bit different, again, depending on what roles you're going for. I think I'm a little bit less qualified to talk about like software engineering roles, but I know there's a whole recruiting process there and a lot of technical prep as well that people have to do on that side. But on the business side, there's also a lot of challenges that you also have to overcome. For example, to get into a strategy and ops role, like what I'm doing now at Google. Well, first of all, I need to caveat that a lot of these firms don't hire directly out of undergrad for S&O roles. But a big hurdle that you have to overcome for S&O is you have to also do case interviews and case studies. And you basically have to demonstrate that you have structured thinking abilities and you can think about a business from like a strategic perspective, which sounds like a lot of buzzwords, but they're looking for people with a consulting skill set. So that's really important to be able to demonstrate as well. Now, general advice for someone who's like a sophomore right now, let's say you don't even know if you want to do consulting or tech, or maybe you're just still deciding, I would say you just need to start talking to people in these industries, any industry, any company that you're like remotely interested in, just find a person on LinkedIn that looks interesting, their background looks interesting to you. It's very easy to also find their email format online. If they work at a large company, you can literally just Google it and be like, TikTok email format, and you'll find it. It's pretty easy. And then email their work email so that they see it, and try to set up some time to chat with them, even if it's just like 20 minutes. And that's going to be going directly to the source, and it's going to give you more insight than just Googling online, oh, what is it like to work at Google or TikTok or BCG, right? And so that's like step number one if you're still pretty early on in deciding. Once you do decide, okay, I want to commit to this one particular industry, then there's like more specific steps that we can talk about next. But that's what I would say is like number one tip of advice for sophomores.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful, because I remember when I was looking to recruit like into tech, one thing I did was I stalked like a ton of people on LinkedIn who had also worked at the same company that I aspired to work at. Then I would just see like, okay, so how did he even get this internship? So I would just work backwards and see, okay, so one thing I noticed when I was recruiting for tech, I noticed like a lot of the people who would break into these tech internships, they would have a good amount of like at least minimum of 3 internships before they would even get that other internship. So I basically just started counting like, okay, I need to do 3 internships, and then I can even qualify to filter myself out and compete with these candidates to make it to the interview stage, to make it to the table. I remember like that's how I used to think about it back then. But things change so fast in this industry. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I would say like just going off of what you said about like internships. Yeah, it's definitely pretty important to have internships on your resume. But at the same time, like if you're really early on, it can be hard to find like that first internship. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem because companies want to hire people that already have internships. But you need experience to be able to get into that company. But then how are you supposed to get that first experience? Right? Someone has to give you a chance. And so usually the first internship that people do is not like the most glamorous. And like for me personally as well, like the first internship that I ever did was unpaid. I just like randomly cold emailed my way into it. And, the work wasn't anything super exciting. I didn't know how to do anything. And so they were having me do like very basic tasks in Excel, but it got my foot in the door and it gave me something to then talk about in like subsequent interviews. So
Exactly.
Really good point on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because even my first internship, I worked in the city, and I would take the train every day. It would be like a two-hour commute just to get there. And I would work in the Bronx at this food company. It was an amazing company, great people. But the work, obviously, we weren't doing anything crazy. I wasn't getting paid. I was getting paid like $14, $15 an hour. So but when I started working there, I realized like, like this is not like I like this job, I like the people, but this is not what I want to do. And I feel like I can do so much more. And that I feel like just starting, it gives you a lot of motivation to figure out other ways, because you learn from senior people in the company, you get to meet and talk to them, and then you can just like understand the way they think, the way they approach problems, and then you go like, I can do this too. Why not me? Now that you worked in like 3 different industries, what do you see that people struggle most with in their careers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say an early career specifically, since that's what I have the most experience with. And I quite honestly, am pretty early on in my career. And so like a lot of these challenges that I'm going to bring up, I still am figuring out. I wouldn't say that I've 100% like got it all under control. But just like some general observations, and this will be, different people have different weaknesses and different areas that they need to improve on and different strengths. But generally, one of the hardest things as an early career professional is just like figuring out like what value you even bring to the table. Because once you graduate, you're going to go probably work at a company and you're going to be the youngest person at the entire company. Most of your coworkers are probably going to be slightly older than you. Like, sure, you're going to have some peers that probably started with you, but like your manager and your manager's manager and everyone else that you report to is going to be older than you and probably have worked at the company a lot longer than you. So they know a lot more than you and they know how to do the job better than you, basically. They also know a lot more about like the company, the industry, etc. And so you're at like an information disadvantage already in the beginning. And you're like the youngest person, right? So like some people will be a little bit ageist and just like assume that like you don't really know how to do anything. And I think one thing that a lot of people struggle with, and like I personally also struggled with very early on, was like figuring out how can I even like be a net positive to the team as opposed to just dead weight. And early on when I was in investment banking, because that was my first job out of college, it was drilled into my mind that the value that you can bring is through even just volunteering and being proactive about like very small things, even if it's just taking notes and sending it to the team after an important call and doing that automatically without having to be asked. Like even small things like that can really help the team out and show that you have a good attitude about it and you're trying to bring value to the table, even if you don't have the industry knowledge per se or the expertise to be able to like contribute in the meeting, right? Like there are other things you can do, like being very proactive about suggesting maybe a call finished up and there's like 5 things that need to be done. And maybe you could even go to your manager and be like, hey, like, so this is what I noted down. I know I can't really help with numbers 1 through 4, but number 5, maybe I can get started with that. Even if they say, actually, let me do that, it's a good way for you to demonstrate to them that you're at least proactive and you want to help, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't think anyone expects you to be able to contribute that much if you've just started that job. And so the expectations are actually kind of low. And so it's very easy to actually exceed those expectations if you just know what to do. And if you're just demonstrating that you're like thinking ahead and not just having to be like told what to do. And then just continuing. Another thing that I see a lot of people struggle with early on in their career, and that I personally also struggled with, was like setting boundaries with like your work and then your personal life. And this applies more to people that work in jobs like consulting or investment banking or just some tech jobs as well, where like you are working a lot of hours, because early on it can feel like you have zero leverage to push back against. And when you just graduated, like you know nothing, right? And so your identity is probably also very, like you probably place a lot of your identity also on your job. And so you want to do a good job at work, which is not a bad thing. But you're also learning how to juggle this totally new life, right? It's different from being in school, because in school you have so much control over like what classes you take. You can like change your schedule around depending on what things you have to do. And so even though you're very busy as a student, you actually have way more control over like, okay, today I'm going to go work out in the morning, or today I'm going to go work out in between my 2 classes. That you don't have that when you're working full time. You're basically on the clock from like 9 a.m. to, maybe 5 or 6 p.m. if you're working in tech. But like if you're in investment banking or consulting, you're pretty much on the clock like 24/7. And so it can be very hard to figure out a balance, and it can be very easy to let your work completely consume your life and you don't end up doing anything outside of work, which is a whole nother issue. But basically a big challenge that I had early on was being able to set boundaries and also figure out what lifestyle and what like work style was sustainable for me. And when you come from a background, like if you're like me and you grew up like with Asian parents and you went to like a pretty decent school and you were basically taught that like hard work equals success, then when you suddenly start at like a company where everyone works a lot, you automatically feel like you have to be working the most in order to succeed in your career. And yes, you do need to put in the hours to do well at work. But what I find is like a lot of people with a similar background, like they don't know how to say no, or they don't know how to push back. They don't know how to take a break, and they will work on the weekend if their boss asks them on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. Hey, we need this thing by Monday. What are you going to do? Say no? No, you're going to drop everything and you're probably going to do it. And I think this was much more of an issue for me when I was still in investment banking. I ultimately left partly due to the work-life balance issues, but I think that's something that applies to people working at any company, honestly. If you're working at a large company, there's going to be situations where people ask you to do things and it's going to bleed into your personal life. And being able to set those boundaries with your manager or just figure out how to make your work-life balance sustainable is a big thing for early career professionals.
Yeah, I think that's amazing advice, because it's so easy to just keep working and make it all about work all the time. I think I also to this day still probably struggle with that. So yeah, that's great advice.
And like just one last thing I'll say about that is I mean, I still struggle with that to this day. It's not like something that's automatically figured itself out after I've been working for a couple of years. Like one of the big things is like, even for me, it's like a struggle for me to take time off. PTO, like paid time off.
Mhm.
Companies usually give you like 15 days a year, maybe more if you work at a more generous company. I think Google is like 20 days a year. But one of the things that I personally struggle with is I don't want to take time off because I always feel like there's work that needs to be done, or I don't want to leave my team hanging. And that's it's a really good thing if you have that attitude, but it's good for work, but it's not good for your own personal mental health and well-being, because you feel like you have so much, you feel like your responsibility to the company is greater than your responsibility to take care of yourself. And that's where like you need to draw the line, I think. And that's something that I'm personally trying to also just improve on.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and also I just keep getting more ideas on
No. Go for it. Go for it. Go for it. I love it.
this might be a contrary opinion, because like nowadays you hear nowadays there is so much like toxic productivity advice online, where it's like, if you aren't the guy who is waking up at 4 a.m. every day, going for a run, and then doing a cold shower and meditating for an hour before you go to work, and then like you work the entire day and you read a book after you come home from work, and you're like, you don't do anything that's unproductive. If you're not that guy, then like you're screwed. Like you're not going to be successful, and you're not going to be wealthy, and you're going to be a failure. Like there's so much advice out there now that advocates for absolutely zero balance. And it's something that my perspectives on this have changed over time, because I would say when I was a student, I was definitely like in the camp of like, I'm going to do whatever it takes and I'm going to work. However, I'm going to literally bust my, I don't know if I can swear, but like, I'm going to like bust.
You can say whatever, man.
Okay, perfect. Like I was that guy in college where I was like, investment bankers work 80 hours a week. No problem. Like I could totally do that. But it's very different when you're actually working those hours versus thinking about that you could do it.
Hmm.
And all that's to say is like, I think there's also this like glorification of overwork that's been going on the internet. Don't get me wrong. You do need to work very hard for things that you want. And you're not going to achieve great things if you aren't willing to at least sacrifice your short-term pleasure for something greater down the line. But at the same time, there's also something to be said about, don't forget about what actually matters in your life. Because once you do achieve that thing, then what next, right?
The question for applying, do you use LinkedIn a lot to apply? Do you rely on referrals? Do you cold apply? Do you apply like as soon as the application opens up? Like what's like your go-to like way to like secure an interview these days?
So for tech, I apply through their website. I keep tabs on LinkedIn. So like I have job alerts turned on for companies that I'm interested in. And I also had email alerts as well. So like Google, for example, I would get like a weekly or monthly email, or actually whenever they posted new jobs, I would get alerts. And so that was how I knew they had recently been posted. And then I would pretty much apply immediately, like the day of, because a company like Google gets so many applications. And even if they have a deadline that's like a month from now, you have to apply ASAP.
Mm-hmm.
Because what you have to understand is they're reviewing these applications on basically a rolling basis usually. And so you want to apply as soon as possible so that you're like the first person that HR sees. Because let's be honest, if 1,000 people apply to the job, then maybe HR is only going to see like the first couple hundred for now. And then they're going to pick like a couple people from that pool to actually interview. And then, they'll probably eventually move down the line, but they're not going to get to person number 1,000, if that makes sense. And so try to apply as soon as possible, honestly. Whenever you get the job alert, apply. Definitely have a referral if you can. Like, I hate to say this, but at a big company, referrals matter a little bit less. Like they still matter, but the problem is many people with referrals still don't end up getting interviews at really big companies like TikTok or Google, just because I would say the size of the company also impacts the referrals impact. What I mean by that is if you got a referral at a very small company, it has a huge impact, because that referral oftentimes will influence the hiring process a lot more than at Google, where like 100 people got a referral. because Google makes it really easy for people to get referrals. They give their employees like a $4,000 referral bonus. There's a very like nice looking portal where you can easily submit a referral to someone. And so like a lot of people, they just submit referrals. And also because Google's so big, like people will give out referrals like candy almost, right? Because even if that person gets hired, they're probably not going to be on your specific team. And so if they do a bad job, no one's going to know like you were the one that referred them, right? Versus if it's a very small company, then like every single person that joins, like people know, oh, you got referred by this person. This person went to bat for you. And if you're bad, then that reflects poorly on the person that works at that company. But all that's to say is referral is like a no regrets type of thing, but it might just have a little bit less impact at a larger company. But that said, it can be easier to get a referral when it's a very large company compared to a small one. And so I applied directly through the website. I have job alerts set up so that I can apply ASAP. I basically apply the day that the job gets posted, or at least the first week that it gets posted. And then I try to get a referral whenever possible. That's the method that I took to get my tech job. And with consulting, it's slightly different just because you have to be aware of the recruiting cycle, which happens at like the same time every year. For tech, I think it happens periodically whenever positions open up.
Yeah, so talking about LinkedIn and reaching out to people, how should someone like reach out to you on LinkedIn? And what's like the best way to go about it? Go into a conversation. You don't want to take too much of someone's time, like 10, 15 minutes. And how do you approach it best?
Yeah. First of all, I don't recommend DMing them on LinkedIn. That's kind of a last resort for me usually, just because first of all, a lot of people don't check their LinkedIn very often. And if they work at a very desirable company, they're probably getting lots of DMs as well. And so like there's a high chance that your DM is getting lost in a sea of other DMs from other students or other people, right? And then thirdly, if you can find their work email instead, then you're guaranteeing that they're going to see your email, because all of these professionals check every single email that goes to their work email. There's no way that they're not going to see it. It's very, very rare that a consultant or like somebody working in tech is not going to see an email that is in their work inbox. It's very likely that they're not going to be checking LinkedIn and they're going to miss your LinkedIn DM. And so whenever you can, that's why I say find their email online, find the email format, and literally just email them. And if the email bounces back, it's fine. Then you can LinkedIn DM them. But just fully understand that you might not get a response that way. The second thing is, even if they don't respond to your email, you need to follow up at least twice. 90% of students do not follow up.
And I followed up a lot on you.
Yeah, Ibrahim followed up a lot with me, which is why we're having this conversation today. But the truth is, as someone who has taken a lot of calls from students, 90% of them never follow up after the first email because they probably think this guy's way too busy. And a lot of times, yeah, maybe like when you did send me the email, I was super busy, but maybe I also thought that I would get back to it later and then I forgot about it, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean they don't want to talk to you. It can often just mean the timing is bad. But if you resurface the email by just quickly following up, then they'll get back to you. And the other thing is, I've also had conversations with people who follow up twice, which is even less common. And when someone follows up twice with you, you realize that they really want to talk to you. And so I've taken a number of calls where I was like, dang, this student, they're like very persistent. I'm going to get on the phone with them because like I respect that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that's why I say like follow up. And then when it comes to scheduling the call, here's what I also recommend, because most students don't do this. Once you do settle on a time, so you should suggest a few times usually in your email to them. But once you do settle on a time, you should suggest sending a calendar invite to their email. And this does a couple things. One, it shows that you're proactive. And two, it shows that you kind of understand how working professionals work. Because in corporate, people are constantly putting time on each other's calendars. But in school, you don't really do that as a student. And so nobody really knows that you're supposed to do that until you start working full time. But then you'll realize one of the easiest, like valuable ways that I can demonstrate that I'm being proactive and helpful is I can literally just set up the calendar invite. I can send you the Zoom link, or I can send you the Google voice call link, or whatever your company uses. And that just takes one step off of their plate that they would have to do otherwise. So that's a very low effort way to actually it's like low effort on your part, but has very high ROI, because like in the professional's eyes, you'll be like, they'll be impressed. Like I'm impressed when people are like, okay, like this time works for us. I'm happy to send over a calendar invite to you. And then I'm like, yeah, sure, do it. And then that way I don't have to do it because I'm going to forget otherwise. And so then we move to actually having the call. And this is where you need to do some preparation. There's way too many people that come into a call with absolutely zero preparation. And I know it sounds crazy, but there are so many people that hop onto a call with me and then they're like super excited to talk to me. And then I'm like, how can I help you? And they just don't even know what to say. And they start rambling. They start talking about like what they're doing at school. And then I'm like, okay, like you told me all these things, but I want to help you as much as we can. We only have about 30 minutes. My time is valuable and I want to use it in the best way possible for you. But if you don't have the questions prepared, then like, how can I help you? Right. Also, a lot of people just don't know how to run the call properly. And so one thing I always tell people is use this. I made this up. It's called the 5-5-5 rule. At the very minimum, you can spend 15 minutes before every single call where you spend 5 minutes Googling the company that they work at, trying to see, like, look at their website, see if there's any news articles, 5 minutes preparing a list of questions. It can be just like 4 or 5 questions, doesn't even need to be that many. And then the last 5 minutes, you game plan how you're going to run the call. And when I say how you're going to run the call, I mean, you're going to say, okay, first, I'm going to do a little bit of small talk, right? I'm going to ask them how their day's going, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to transition to, hey, well, thanks so much for taking the time today. Really, the purpose of this call was I wanted to learn a little bit more about TikTok and specifically what you're doing in that product ops role. But before we get into that, would it be helpful if I first give a quick background on myself? Does that sound good to you? Even if you just say that, and that was like 10 seconds, to them, they're going to be impressed because they're going to be like, wow, he's very organized. He knows what he wants to get out of this call, and he's not just here to waste my time, right? And so, and then you can also plan to ask your questions and then end by maybe making some sort of request. Like maybe you ask them if there's someone else you can talk to at their company, or maybe you ask some other thing. Even just taking 5 minutes to think about how you're going to run it can go a really long way. And so do the 5-5-5 rule. 5 minutes of just desktop research, Googling their company so you don't like ask a question that can easily be found online. 5 minutes of just coming up with a list of questions, and then 5 minutes just thinking about how do I actually want to run this call and what do I want to get out of it. That's what I would give as advice for people.
That's amazing. That's really good advice.
I don't think students realize how low the bar is for doing these calls. You probably think that everyone doing these calls is like very organized and very prepared, and they all come across really well, but you'd be surprised. Probably more than half of the calls that I do with students do not go well. And usually they don't go well because, one, they weren't organized, and maybe that meant that they didn't come with the right questions, or they didn't even have questions, or they just rambled and they just talked about themselves for like the majority of the call. And then we get to the end of the call and they're like, oh wait, I didn't ask any questions. Oops. And I'm like, okay, so why did you set up this time? But all that's to say is like most people are actually not very prepared for these calls. And so it's so easy to set yourself apart from the competition by literally just doing these very low effort things, even just spending 15 minutes before you go into a call preparing.
How would you like advise someone to approach these consulting case interview questions? Like, are there any best practices?
Oh gosh, there is so much that I could say that I don't think I'm going to be able to fully cover today. I mean, my entire channel has a ton of content specifically for case interviews. But broadly speaking, if you're preparing for case interviews specifically for strategy consulting positions at firms like McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, then step number 1 is you need to understand what case interviews are and why they're being used in the interview process. And I think most people are like, oh yeah, of course I know what a case interview is, right? Like they give you a question and then you have to like come up with like a framework and do some math maybe, and then make a recommendation. But really understanding what they're testing for and why they're using the case interview is like step number 1. And then after that, it's like actually preparing and practicing so that you can do the case interviews well and come across like professional and confident and self-assured in the case interview without being like too arrogant. But there's a whole set of steps, like micro steps involved with that. Like you want to start with doing a little bit of self-studying, right? Whether that is reading Victor Cheng's Case Interview Secrets, which is a book written by a former McKinsey consultant, or self-studying some case interview examples out there online. And then eventually you want to do your first case live with a practice partner, usually someone that you're more comfortable with, because the first time that you do a case, it usually doesn't go very well. And so just ripping the Band-Aid off as soon as possible is really important, though, because eventually you're going to need to practice with more people that you're less familiar with. And then getting feedback and identifying the weakness areas that you need to improve on is really important, because a lot of students, they just put in a lot of reps and they do a lot of cases, but then they don't improve that much. And that's problematic, because it doesn't matter how many cases you're doing. I don't care if you did 100 case interviews. If you didn't improve at all from case 1 to case 100, then there's no point. It's better to do like 20 or 30 cases and to improve incrementally each time, so that by case 30, you're like much more prepared for the interview. And how do you get that feedback? Well, you have to get the feedback from people that actually know how to case. And so sometimes this means you can't just case with like your buddy or your roommate, unless they also got an offer. Then their advice will be valuable. But if you're starting with no one in your immediate network who knows how to case, then you need to also find people, whether it's through networking or meeting people at campus clubs and stuff like that, who can actually be good partners for you.
And then when it comes to cracking the tech interviews, especially in the S&O strategy and ops, can you share any insights on that process?
Yeah, so I think interviewing for the strategy and ops role, a big component of it is explaining why you want to make that transition from consulting over to S&O, because although people may see these two jobs as very similar, they're very different as well. Consulting is very different from working in-house at a company. Consulting, you're an advisor, you're working with many different companies, clients, you're working on usually short-term projects, you're switching teams a lot, and you're never really getting that deep to one topic, but you get to taste a lot of different topics. Versus S&O is you're working at one company, you're focused on one thing, and you're usually way deeper in the weeds because you now work at that company. And the team that you work with, it's going to be the same. You're going to work with the same manager for a really long time, ideally. And there's also a lot more complexity around implementation now of the strategy, because you can come up with all the fanciest ideas in the world, but it doesn't mean anything if you can't get those things done at the company that you work at. And so that's another big difference. And so being able to demonstrate in the interview process that, hey, I work in consulting right now and I like XYZ things about consulting, but at the same time, I want these additional things, whether it's like more ownership and more accountability with the whole process, from developing the strategy all the way to executing it and implementing the strategy. Or maybe I just want the opportunity to get a lot deeper into the company than I get on a consulting project. Being able to explain that in a concise way is really important in the interview process, because they interview a lot of consultants. So how are they going to choose between two consultants that have the exact same background? They're going to probably go with the guy that has a better story explaining why he wants to do that role or why he's a good fit for that role. And some of the other stuff, like doing the case interview, that's kind of table stakes, because if you got into consulting, it's usually expected that you're decent at casing. They do have that as part of the interview process, but I don't want to generalize, but if you're a half decent consultant, you shouldn't have too many issues with the casing portion for S&O interviews. It's more going to be about selling your story and being convincing in the behavioral portion of the interview. I think that's something that a lot of people underestimate the importance of. They think that, oh, just because I'm really good at casing, I'm definitely going to land this job. But no, you have to remember that interviewing is a very human activity. And like the person on the other side of the table is just another person. And imagine, like, put yourself in their shoes and think about what they're thinking, right? They want to hire someone that, one, obviously has the qualifications for the job, but two, it has to be someone that they can see themselves working next to. Because if they hire you, you're going to be at their company for who knows how long, right? And so if they make a bad hire, then they're stuck with you, at least for the time being. So that's why it's actually so important to come across as like a likable person, and even basic things like just being friendly and smiling in the interview go a long way with that.
That's awesome. What advice would you give to your younger self?
I love this question. It's also a very difficult one. I would say the advice I would give my younger self is don't be afraid to shoot high. Because I think the younger Matt had a lot of limiting beliefs around what type of career or what company he deserved to work at, or what kind of life that he was able to attain. And I think when you're very early on in your life, you haven't seen that many things, or you haven't achieved that many things yet. And so you usually don't have as much confidence in your ability to do something great or to get that thing, like that dream job, right? And again, it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem, because if you don't have the accomplishments to show yourself that, hey, I am this person, I'm this successful person, then it's very difficult to convince yourself, because most people are going to be riddled with all sorts of limiting beliefs. Like they're gonna think, oh, like I'm not attractive enough, I'm not like well spoken enough, like I'm not athletic enough, I'm not charismatic enough, like, oh, I don't come from a rich family, and like my dad doesn't work in investment banking or tech, so like I'm already at a disadvantage compared to that person at school who, you know, they grew up in wealth and like they went to like some fancy boarding school, and they have all these connections, right? Like they're at such a big advantage compared to me. Like how could I ever achieve that job at Google or that job at Goldman Sachs, right? A lot of people will have these kinds of beliefs, and inherently that sabotages them, because then they don't even want to try to get this kind of a job. Like I remember when I was a student, I was like scared to apply to Goldman Sachs, because I was like, oh, there's no way I'm going to get an interview. Like it's not even worth the effort. Like why am I even trying then? Like I know that the person that is going to get the job is going to be someone who's like so impressive. And to be fair, like you'll hear about all these different people on campus when you're a student. Oh yeah, so and so got this like crazy internship, right? Like so and so got this job at like this big company, like wow. And you'll look at that person and they're usually going to be like very impressive, or they're going to be the person that speaks up in class all the time. And you think, dang, like that's just not me. Like I'm not that guy. But the problem is, if you think that, then you're not going to be that, right? Because whatever you think, you become. And so if you think that, oh, I'm never going to be the guy that can land that really elite job, or I'm never going to be the guy that can make like a ton of money, you're never going to turn into that guy, because inherently your mind is going to hold you back from even trying. And so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing, where if you believe something's not possible, then it's not going to be possible for you. And then you're going to believe it further, right? Because then the evidence in the real world will back up what you were thinking. So all that's to say, I think I would have told my younger self to like not be so influenced by these limiting beliefs, and to just shoot high. And it sounds cliche, but like, what's the saying? Like you shoot for the stars and you might land on the moon. That's honestly pretty true, because you never know how far you can actually go. Like even with this YouTube channel that I've started like a year ago, I remember when I just started, I was like, if I could get 1,000 subscribers by the end of a year, I would be ecstatic. And I grinded super hard and somehow got to 1,000 subscribers after like 6 months of weekly posting. It was the grindiest time of my life. And now, like yesterday, I got over 1,000 subscribers in a day. And so I was just looking back on that, and I was like talking to my friends, and I was thinking, dang, like if you had told me from a year ago that this would be happening now, and like now the channel's kind of taking off, but the graph on my YouTube analytics, it just looks flat for a really long time, and then suddenly it shoots up. And I think that's how a lot of these things happen in life, where like you do a shit ton of work and nothing happens, or it doesn't seem like anything's happening, but like something is happening, but you just don't see it, because the result, it's all just building up, and then suddenly it like shoots up, and that's when you see it. And then people are like, oh, he's so successful, like, oh my gosh, like I knew he was gonna succeed and like be this really good guy. But like obviously it's easy for them to say that when you achieve that success. It's much harder when you're like in the early days of building something or trying to achieve some kind of goal. And so a lot of people quit, and it's because of the limiting beliefs, or they don't even try for the big things, and they just never know. Like it's lost potential. You never know what you are capable of if you don't try.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's actually like a lot of the great athletes also talk about, you know, how you should believe in yourself, manifest, and just work really hard. So
yeah. No, I mean, like it's like, I don't want to sound like any other like self-improvement guru out there, but like there is an ounce of truth in what people say. Consistency is really important. I think also it's not just consistency though, it's also like improvement and getting a little bit better each time. Because again, like I said with the case interviews, if you do 100 case interviews but you don't improve, then there's no point. So it's not just the consistency aspect, but it's also the aspect of wanting to improve each time. And I think that is maybe where some people are a little bit less, that's where some people struggle a little bit more, because to improve, depending on what it is, to improve might mean that you need to get feedback from people that know what they're doing, or you need to go and like research this industry very well and very thoroughly, which takes a lot of time, or you need to like read certain books or like consume certain types of content, and maybe like you just don't want to do that, or you have other things going on. And so like a lot of people will not improve even though they're putting in like the consistency. And I think that's like another aspect of it that's really important to emphasize, is like you need to have the dissatisfaction within you. Like one of the things that for me personally that I still struggle with is like every time I post a video, I don't think it's good enough. And there's been so many instances where like I didn't want to post this video because I thought to myself, this isn't my best work. Like the lighting was bad. I don't look good in this video. The idea isn't that good. I feel like the thumbnail sucks and like the title's not good either. Like who's going to watch this? Who's going to click on this? Like I should just wait another week, or I should just wait another month before I post the video so that it can be perfect, right? The problem is that if you keep thinking that, you're never going to post. And, you know, no one's forcing you to post on social media, for example, on YouTube. It's all driven by you, really. And so it's very easy to make excuses why you shouldn't do it. But the problem is like you also need the volume early on in order to improve. So like some people will say, yeah, like on YouTube, quality matters way more than quantity, right? And yes, it's true to an extent, but for 99% of people that start off on YouTube, or if you're like, this applies to like getting a job too, right? Like, but for YouTube specifically, since we're talking about it, you need to do the reps. You need to do the weekly posts, and like you need to like get the volume up so that you can get to the quality. And I think Mr. Beast has some quote where he's like, don't talk to me until you've posted 100 videos. And, you know, it's a little bit extreme what he's saying, of course, but at the same time, I kind of understand what he's getting at. Even for me, like I probably posted 60 plus videos at this point. Each video I post, like now, if I look back to a year ago, obviously there's a huge difference in quality, but it just makes me wonder, like 40 videos from now, how much better will it be? And so that's why I think it's also important to get the volume in early on so that you can learn what sucks and what doesn't suck and what works. And then you can eventually slow down and maybe focus more on quality. But anyways, I went on a huge rant there, but like I'm super passionate about this stuff. So that I think this advice applies not just to content creation, but a lot of things in life.
Great advice. Any books you'd recommend we read?
I'm laughing because part of me wants to be like, stop reading books and start taking action, you know, like, but at the same time, a couple of books that have been very helpful for me. One book that honestly, it sounds cheesy, but like kind of changed my life was Dopamine Nation, which I don't know if you've read that book before, but basically it's written by this, I think, Stanford psychologist or psychiatrist. And it just breaks down how dopamine works in your brain and why like nowadays in today's day and age, people are so unmotivated. And for me, it was a really eye-opening book because it made me realize that consuming a lot of content online and doing a lot of the things that like are normal nowadays actually is decreasing your motivation to do hard things. And once I read that book, I realized that I was doing a lot of these things and not even realizing like, oh, this is why I feel so unmotivated when I wake up in the morning. And this is why after I binge like playing video games for 3 hours, I don't want to do hard work. And once I realized that, something switched in my mind. And I actually read this right before I started my YouTube channel last year. And it kind of motivated me to make a significant change in some of the ways that I live my life, even small things. And even nowadays, like I'm a lot more cognizant of, you know, like I have like some social media apps on my phone, but I've tried to avoid like short form content. So like I don't have TikTok or Instagram on my phone right now. Occasionally I'll download it if like my friend sends me something, but it's, for me, just personally, that book has completely shifted the way that I view social media and these like high dopamine activities. And I want to be able to channel it more into productive pursuits like content and my career. And so That's why I recommend that book to anyone who's been feeling like they don't know why they can't get things done, or they don't know why they just lack the motivation. It's a very eye-opening book, so I would recommend that. And the second book that I really like is maybe for people who are a little bit more philosophical, or if you have questions about like happiness in life, is The Almanac of Naval Ravikant. That book is also very fascinating. Naval Ravikant, for those who don't know, he's like a venture
Jeez.
capitalist. Yeah, and he actually was a former BCG consultant as well. And he just has a lot of really interesting perspectives on money, on happiness, and it's a very interesting book for anyone who is interested in those topics, or like searching for the meaning of life, that kind of thing. It's worth a read. It's very interesting. It's very different from your typical like self-help kind of books. So those are the two books that I would recommend.
Cool. Awesome. For people watching who want to, get in touch with you, I know you have a specific way to like reach out. You have like a community, like where you do consulting cases on school. So where can they find you? How can they sign up for this? Like, if you can just tell us more.
Yeah, so right now, actually, I'm not accepting people into the school community, but that is only because I'm working on something that I'm going to be launching probably in the next couple months. It's going to be similar to it, but a little bit different. And so right now, I would recommend just subscribing, or no, I'm just kidding. Right now, I would recommend just checking out the YouTube channel if you haven't yet. I'm assuming the link will be in the description below, but that's the easiest way to find me. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I have my LinkedIn on my channel, and also you can just search my name. And yeah, so those are the two ways that you can reach out to me, and feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn or anything like that.
Awesome. Well, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for, doing this podcast. For the people listening and watching, if you've watched this far, you're a real one. So like and comment, guys. That's what keeps me motivated to keep pushing and pushing out these podcasts. But Matt's a legend. I think he gave some amazing advice. Definitely check out his YouTube channel. It's literally free game for anyone working in corporate. Each video is amazing. So definitely give his channel a subscribe. Really nice talking to you, Matt.
Thanks for having